At night, a carrier flight deck does not look like transportation. It looks like a machine that has learned how to breathe. Steam hangs in the dark. Colored jerseys move with rehearsed urgency. Pilot taxis toward a catapult, salutes, and is gone into black air almost before the eye has finished, following the shape of the aircraft. From a distance, it can look like noise and light and controlled confusion. From inside the system, it is something much more precise. It is a floating airfield, a command post, a logistics hub, and a visible political message, all moving together at sea. When people talk about naval power, they often talk as if the ocean were a blank surface and ships merely happen to pass across it. The reality is harder, denser, and more crowded than that simple image suggests. The ocean is not empty. It is organized by routes, watched by sensors, shaped by weather, constrained by fuel and time, and contested by states that understand how much political leverage can travel on the back of steel and salt water. That is the argument of this episode. A carrier strike group is not just a carrier with a few ships sailing nearby. It is a moving system of aircraft, radars, missiles, command relationships, and replenishment links that turns open water into controlled military space. It can project force outward, but it can also absorb, sort, and respond to information coming in from hundreds of miles away. It is visible enough to deter, mobile enough to complicate planning, and complex enough that most of its actual strength is hidden in the relationships between its parts. The carrier is the symbol. The strike group is the reality. The official Navy description of the aircraft carrier is useful here because it cuts through romance and gets to function. The carrier is the centerpiece of the force necessary for operating forward. It supports and operates aircraft that can strike airborne, afloat, and ashore targets that threaten free use of the sea. The ship itself is massive, but the scale matters less than what the scale allows. Large magazines, large fuel stores, large command spaces, large maintenance areas, and large sortie potential mean persistence. Persistence is the real currency. A Navy that can stay on station, launch aircraft repeatedly, and keep doing it day after day changes the behavior of everyone around it, even before a weapon is fired. The carrier by itself, though, is not the full answer. That is why the official description keeps pointing back to the strike group. A carrier and its strike group are built to do more than one job at once. They can deter a state that is considering a move, protect shipping in a threatened area, support a larger joint campaign, show up first during a crisis, and then remain present long enough for diplomats and commanders to make decisions that are not forced by panic. That last point matters more than most people notice. Naval power is often described in terms of destruction, but much of its real value lies in buying time, creating options, and controlling tempo. Force that can stay in the right place with the right mix of aircraft, escorts, fuel, and command capacity can slow other people down simply by existing. To understand why the ocean is not empty, it helps to start with the human mistake that emptiness suggests. Maps flatten the sea. They make large bodies of water look blank between points of land. A shipping route becomes a thin line. A choke point becomes a narrow label. A patrol box becomes a shaded polygon. None of that shows the density of movement, the uncertainty of weather, the limits imposed by endurance, or the importance of timing. The moment a convoy is delayed, a tanker misses a rendezvous, or a radar picture becomes uncertain, the ocean stops looking empty and starts looking like a logistics problem under pressure. Navies know this instinctively. They plan around distance because distance consumes fuel, consumes maintenance life, consumes crew alertness, and consumes the margin that lets a commander choose rather than react. Commercial shipping understands it too. UN Trade and Development states that around 80% of the volume of international trade in goods is carried by sea. That single fact explains why maritime control matters far beyond the military sphere. The sea is not only a battle space, it is also the physical network through which industrial inputs, food, fuel, components, and finished goods keep moving. Every discussion about carriers, destroyers, submarines, and replenishment ships sits on top of that deeper structure. A navy is not only protecting a fleet, it is protecting the conditions under which global economic life continues without coercion. That does not make naval operations gentle, it makes them structural. When a major navy controls movement through a region, it affects more than military diagrams. It affects insurance markets, shipping schedules, commodity prices, diplomatic leverage, and the confidence with which companies and states make decisions. That is why carrier groups are linked so closely to choke points. People tend to name the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Suez Canal approaches, the South China Sea, and the island chains of the Western Pacific because those are the places where sea traffic and military pressure can become visible at the same time. But the more interesting truth is that choke points are not isolated exceptions. They are the visible knots in a much larger web of routes, dependencies, and patrol obligations. A carrier strike group does not need to sit directly on top of a narrow passage to shape it. Aircraft range, escort capabilities, command links, and intelligence flows allow the group to influence space beyond the horizon. That is one reason carriers matter politically. They can affect a region larger than the water immediately beneath them. So what actually makes up a carrier strike group? The exact composition changes with deployment, mission, and availability, which is why careless certainty is a bad habit in naval explanation. But public Navy pages and strike group command pages give the broad pattern clearly enough. A modern group centers on the carrier and its embarked air wing. Around that core are surface combatants, usually guided missile destroyers, and sometimes a cruiser where the class is still available. Those ships bring radar coverage, missile magazines, command and control functions, anti-air and anti-surface capability, and part of the anti-submarine defense screen. Often there is also an attack submarine operating in support, although the most important part of submarine support is usually the part the public is not meant to see in real time. Beyond those warfighting platforms, there is always the harder and less glamorous truth of logistics. A group that intends to stay on station needs fuel, food, parts, munitions movement, mail, repair capacity, and scheduled replenishment. The combat picture only exists because the support picture keeps it alive. The carrier itself is not merely a runway at sea, it is a maintenance ecosystem. Aircraft do not just launch and recover, they are inspected, armed, fueled, debriefed, repaired, moved, spotted, and scheduled again. The flight deck is only the visible surface of that work. Beneath it are the spaces that make sortie generation possible. Hangar areas, workshops, parts handling, fueling systems, crew berthing, command spaces, galleys, and the hidden machinery that sustains the whole ship. The reason the carrier remains militarily valuable is not that it is large for the sake of size. It is that the ship can carry the people, systems, and endurance needed to keep aircraft operations going long after a land-based crisis would have overloaded smaller or less integrated platforms. The air wing is what turns the carrier from presence into reach. An embarked air wing brings fighters, electronic attack aircraft, early warning aircraft, helicopters, and the people needed to keep all of them effective. The exact wing mix changes over time, and public inventories should always be treated as snapshots rather than eternal truths. Still, the basic logic holds. The carrier projects power not because it contains some mystical property, but because it can generate repeated cycles of launch, mission execution, recovery, rearm, and relaunch. That cycle is what matters. One dramatic launch looks cinematic. Hundreds of disciplined launches and recoveries across days or weeks are what create sustained military effect. This is where the flight deck stops being spectacle and becomes math. Every aircraft spot, every catapult cycle, every fueling movement, every sortie generation decision is part of a balancing act between opportunity and risk. Launch too slowly and you waste the carrier's greatest advantage. Launch too aggressively without regard to maintenance and deck safety, and you degrade the whole machine. The crew therefore manages tempo, not just motion. Tempo is the product of organization. The ship must know which aircraft are ready, which crews are rested, which weapons are available, what weather is coming, which missions matter most, and how all of that fits into the wider commander's objective. A carrier that launches aircraft without that discipline is merely noisy. A carrier that launches under discipline becomes strategically relevant. The E-2D Advanced Hawkeye is one of the clearest examples of how the air wing changes what the strike group can know. Naval describes the E-2D as the newest variant of the E-2 platform, equipped with a state-of-the-art radar and improved aircraft systems. It also calls the aircraft a critical capability for broad area coverage, battle management, airborne early warning, and command and control. Those phrases can sound generic until you sit with the implication. The E-2D is not simply another aircraft in the launch cycle. It is part of the group's ability to build a larger picture than shipboard radars alone can provide. It helps link detection, classification, coordination, and command decisions across a wider volume of air and sea space. That matters because the strike group is only as good as its picture. A warship does not act based on raw data alone. It acts on an interpreted environment. Which contacts are routine, which are unusual, which are potentially hostile, which belong to civilian traffic, which should be tracked continuously, which should be ignored for now. The public usually sees the end of this process, perhaps in the form of a launch clip or a radar display shown for effect. The real work is the disciplined sorting that happens long before anyone outside the group would call a situation dramatic. If the picture is wrong, decisions made at speed are not bold, they are reckless. That is one reason the destroyer screen remains so important. The surface escorts are not decorative companions for the carrier. They are part of the group's defensive geometry. They extend radar coverage, add missile launch capacity, and help distribute the burden of watchstanding, tracking, and potential engagement. On the public side, the Aegis combat system offers a useful way to explain this. Naval describes Aegis as the Navy's most modern surface combat system and emphasizes that it was designed as a complete system in which launchers, computer programs, radar, and displays are fully integrated. That integration is the point. A ship defending a carrier group is not just carrying missiles. It is participating in a coherent combat system that helps detect, identify, and engage incoming threats as part of a layered defense. The newer SPY-6 radar improvements sharpen that picture further. Naval's description of SPY-6 on Flight 3 destroyers emphasizes automatic detect and track capability, long-range sensitivity, rapid search and tracking, and integration with Aegis. More important than any single technical phrase is the operational outcome. Surface escorts can contribute to a more resilient, more capable air and missile defense architecture around the group. That does not mean they create a perfect shield. Perfect shields do not exist in war. What they create is time, confidence, and multiple opportunities to act before a threat reaches the carrier itself. People often want these explanations to collapse into a single number. How many targets? How many missiles? How far? How fast? Public reporting and official pages do not always support those exact comparisons in a stable way, and disciplined narration should resist inventing them. The more honest explanation is that the group seeks overlap. Different ships, sensors, and aircraft contribute to the same problem from different positions. The purpose is not magical invulnerability. It is resilient coverage. If one node degrades, another may still see something. If one missile layer is stressed, another may still matter. If one contact picture is uncertain, airborne and surface systems can still help sort it. This is not elegant because it is simple. It is effective because it is redundant. The submarine screen is the part most observers understand least and romanticize most. Public descriptions of the Virginia class help strip that romance back to function. Naval describes Virginia-class submarines as platforms built to dominate littoral and deep waters while conducting anti-submarine warfare, anti-surface ship warfare, strike warfare, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, special operations support, irregular warfare, and mine warfare missions. That list explains why a strike group values submarine support even when the public cannot see it. The submarine contributes stealth, persistence, and uncertainty. It can look ahead of the surface force, monitor what others are doing, and threaten adversary ships or submarines without advertising its own exact position. The word uncertainty matters here. Much of naval power is about managing your own uncertainty while increasing someone else's. A carrier group wants its own commanders to have a clearer picture than the adversary has. The submarine helps with that balance. To an opponent trying to track a strike group, the possibility of a nearby attack submarine complicates movement, sensing, and confidence. To the strike group itself, that same submarine offers extra warning, extra reach, and extra offensive options in a domain where visibility is always partial. Public discussion of submarines often drifts toward myth, but the practical truth is already strong enough. The unseen platform changes the geometry of risk for everyone else. There is a temptation to imagine the strike group as an offensive instrument only, as though its main purpose were simply to sail close to a region and threaten airstrikes. That view misses the degree to which the group is also a manager of space. It can escort, watch, reassure, signal, interdict, support, and absorb information. Its aircraft can be used to strike, but they can also be used to patrol, to provide warning, to maintain a broader picture, and to support maritime security work. The carrier strike group therefore has political value precisely because it is not locked into a single action. It can escalate, but it can also delay, observe, and shape. That flexibility is not a side feature. It is central to why policymakers keep asking where the carriers are. The official aircraft carrier fact file reinforces this broader role. It describes carriers and their strike groups as able to interdict threats to merchant shipping and prevent the use of the seas for terrorism and piracy. That matters because it connects high-end warfighting to everyday maritime order. Carrier group built for serious conflict can also help maintain the conditions under which civilian movement continues. Those missions are not interchangeable, and they require different political judgment. Still, they share the same underlying logic. Sea control is meaningful because control of the sea shapes what everyone else is able to do. No discussion of sea control is complete without logistics, because sea control without endurance is performance, not power. The John Lewis-class replenishment oiler gives a clear official anchor for the basic point. Naval states that these ships, operated by Military Sealift Command, provide underway replenishment of fuel and stores to U.S. Navy ships at sea and jet fuel for aircraft assigned to carriers. That simple sentence explains half the operational reality that dramatic footage leaves out. Carriers burn aviation fuel. Escorts burn ship fuel. Crews eat. Aircraft need parts. Weapons expenditure must be planned and replaced. If you want a strike group to operate forward for long periods, you are committing yourself to a constant support problem. Underway replenishment is where the romantic image of the fleet meets the sober discipline of sustainment. It is the moment when ships moving through open water must conduct the close, technical, repeated transfer of fuel, cargo, and support under conditions that can never be treated casually. The evolution is ordinary in the sense that it happens again and again. It is extraordinary in the sense that a force whose public image revolves around missiles and aircraft still depends on cables, pumps, hoses, deck crews, station keeping, and precise seamanship. In practical terms, a Navy demonstrates seriousness not only by launching aircraft, but by proving that it can refuel and rearm the whole moving system without needing a safe port every time. This is one reason logistics ships deserve much more attention in naval explanation than they usually receive. Public audience sees the carrier. Professionals ask how long it can remain effective, what it needs, when it will replenish, what its escorts have available, and how quickly damaged or exhausted capacity can be restored. The same is true in crisis. A commander looking at a map is not merely asking where the group is. The commander is also asking what the group can still sustain after several days, what support assets are nearby, what sea state is doing to flight operations, and whether the replenishment pattern itself introduces new vulnerability. Logistics do not sit behind combat. They shape the edges of combat from the beginning. The carrier's own internal scale reinforces that logic. A Pacific Fleet article on USS Nimitz notes the ship's ability to serve 18,000 meals per day and distill more than 400,000 gallons of fresh water daily. Those numbers are useful not because they are theatrical, but because they reveal the carrier as a living industrial platform. 5,000 people do not remain functional by symbolism. They remain functional by food, water, engineering reliability, maintenance, and watch rotation. Once that becomes clear, the carrier stops looking like a single ship and starts looking like a mobile town whose daily life is inseparable from its combat potential. That daily life includes a second kind of logistics most audiences never see: the logistics of information. Contacts must be shared, warnings must be distributed, fuel states and sortie plans must be updated. Intelligence summaries must move into a usable operational picture. Maintenance limits must be understood. The group commander is not simply steering ships and launching aircraft. The commander is integrating multiple clocks. There is the air tasking clock, the replenishment clock, the watchstanding clock, the weather clock, the transit clock, and the political clock above all of them. One of the most useful things a strike group does well is synchronize those clocks so that the force does not spend itself faster than it can achieve its objective. This is why open ocean does not mean freedom from constraint. In movies, distance at sea often feels like room to maneuver. In reality, distance is also a tax. Aircraft radius matters. Replenishment spacing matters. The location of escorts matters. The need to maintain a coherent defensive and command posture matters. Even something as simple as weather can alter sortie, tempo, visibility, deck safety, and sensor effectiveness in ways that reverberate across the whole force. The strike group is powerful because it can manage these constraints better than many alternatives, not because it magically escapes them. The political use of a carrier strike group depends on that same balance between reach and limitation. Leaders want carriers because they are visible, mobile, and self-contained enough to send a signal quickly. A carrier can show up offshore without needing immediate host nation basing permission, in the same way a land-based package might. It can remain where it is useful. It can increase or decrease operational tempo. It can support coalition work or act as a unilateral signal. But none of that makes the carrier a universal answer. Carriers do not remove geography. They do not eliminate missile threats. They do not erase submarine risk. They do not solve political indecision. They are powerful tools, not floating exemptions from reality. That distinction matters especially in the missile age. Public debate often swings between two extremes. In one extreme, the carrier is still treated as an untouchable emperor of the sea. In the other, it is treated as a helpless relic doomed by any modern missile inventory. Both views are lazy. The public record tells a more serious story. Escorts have improved. Aegis has improved. SPY-6 improves detection and tracking. E-2D increases airborne coverage and battle management. Carriers themselves have been designed for long service life and sustained power projection. At the same time, official missile defense and Navy statements make clear that advanced missile threats, including hypersonic capabilities, create real tracking and engagement challenges. The carrier remains central, not because the threat environment is easy, but because the Navy keeps adapting the system around it. That adaptation is also visible in the Ford class. Naval describes USS Gerald R. Ford as engineered for new technologies, higher sortie generation, and approximately 3 times more electrical generation capacity than the Nimitz class. That is not just an engineering brag. It is a clue about where carrier relevance now lives. Relevance depends on adaptability. New sensors, new networks, new aircraft, new electronic demands, and new defensive burdens all require power, integration space, and design margin. A carrier that cannot evolve becomes a symbol of past strength. A carrier that can evolve remains useful in new strategic conditions. It is also worth saying plainly that carriers do not operate for their own sake. They operate in support of national objectives that are often broader than combat. Presence can reassure allies, complicate an adversary's timetable, reinforce freedom of navigation, and support disaster response or evacuation planning. The same hull that launches strike aircraft can provide helicopters, command and control assets, medical capacity, and communication support when the mission changes. That breadth is why carriers survive criticism more successfully than some observers expect. They are expensive. They are vulnerable in certain ways, as all major platforms are, but they are also unusually flexible instruments for a state that intends to remain globally engaged. The fourth fact is that modern Hormuz security is not just a warship story. It is a layered management problem. The U.S. Navy has to think about escorts, helicopters, radar coverage, drone defense, small boat screening, mine fears, suspicious commercial behavior, and the difference between a route that is technically available and a route that is judged safe enough to use at normal scale. That is why the route can look open on television while still feeling dangerous to the people who have to move real cargo through it. The fifth fact is that markets do not wait for a clean legal announcement that a sea route is closed, and they do not instantly trust a clean political announcement that it has reopened. They react to danger, backlog, hesitation, and uncertainty. The Energy Information Administration linked the first quarter oil price surge of 2026 to the military escalation that followed February 28 and described a de facto closure of the strait. It later reported that Middle East crude tanker rates in March hit their highest level in the series going back to November 2005. That is how these crises spread. A missile launch does not need to sink every tanker. It only needs to convince enough operators, insurers, charterers, and governments that routine passage is no longer routine. That is why the Strait of Hormuz is more than a Gulf story. It is a story about the architecture of world energy, the burden of keeping sea lanes open, the difficulty of restoring confidence after a crisis touches shipping, and the problem Washington faces when its military presence, alliance commitments, and economic interests all converge in the same narrow place. The United States may want the shooting to stop and the route to calm down. But after a closure scare, the harder job is not announcing peace. The harder job is making the route feel boring again. To understand why this one passage matters so much, it helps to begin with geography stripped of drama. The strait is the maritime exit from the Persian Gulf. Every producer and exporter inside that basin lives with a simple physical reality. If cargo leaves Gulf terminals by sea, it must eventually pass through Hormuz unless it can be diverted to one of the limited pipeline routes that bypass the choke point. That is what makes the strait so different from an ordinary shipping lane. It is not just busy, it is structurally necessary. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Iran all sit inside a broader regional system whose commercial seaborne flows depend on that exit. Some of those states are political rivals, some are U.S. partners, some are targets or actors inside the current crisis. But the geometry does not care about diplomacy. It forces the same question on everyone. How do you get energy out of the Gulf when the one gateway to the open ocean becomes threatened? That is why the EIA's baseline numbers matter so much. They tell us that Hormuz is not merely one important route among many. It is one of the central valves of the global energy system. Around 1/5 of the world's petroleum liquids consumption depends on it in normal conditions. Around 1/5 of global LNG trade passes through it as well. More than 1/4 of seaborne oil trade moves through that same corridor. If a war planner wanted to identify a place where naval tension could produce immediate economic leverage, this would be near the top of the list. Much of that flow goes to Asia, which is another reason the strait matters beyond the Middle East itself. The choke point crisis in Hormuz is not simply about whether U.S. consumers import most of their own crude from the Gulf. That is not how world oil pricing works. Oil is globally traded, benchmarks are internationally priced, and shipping disruptions influence everyone, even when the molecule burned in one country was not loaded in the Gulf. China, India, Japan, South Korea, and other Asian importers care because they depend on those flows more directly. Europe cares because a supply shock tightens the broader market and raises competition for alternatives. The United States cares because it lives inside the same pricing system, the same alliance system, and the same financial system that absorbs the damage when one of the world's key maritime exits becomes unstable. There is another misunderstanding that often appears in public debate. People assume a big producer like the United States should be insulated from a Gulf crisis because it pumps a lot of oil at home. But domestic production does not create a sealed national market. American consumers still buy fuel priced in a world market. U.S. airlines still buy jet fuel. Trucking companies still buy diesel. Chemical plants still buy feedstocks. And financial expectations still move with global benchmarks. If a shock pushes crude higher, shipping higher, and inventories lower, those effects show up in the United States, whether or not the barrel itself started on the Gulf Coast of Texas or in a terminal farther east. That is also why LNG matters. The Strait is not only an oil artery, it is a major route for natural gas carried in liquefied form. For importers that rely on LNG cargoes, especially in Asia, the security of the Strait is tied to electricity systems, industrial demand, and winter storage decisions. Crisis in Hormuz therefore becomes a broader fuel security problem, not just a crude oil problem. It affects how countries hedge, how traders price seasonal demand, and how much policymakers worry about secondary shocks in power and manufacturing. The obvious answer is bypass. If the route is so risky, why not simply move the energy another way? The short answer is that there are bypass options, but not enough. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates do have pipeline infrastructure that can move some volumes around the Strait. But the EIA is explicit that this capacity is limited. It cannot fully replace the normal volume that moves through Hormuz. In a real disruption, pipelines help, but they do not solve the problem. They reduce some exposure. They do not eliminate it. This is why Washington's stake in Hormuz is broader than import arithmetic. It is about credibility, allied resilience, financial stability, and the expectation that the U.S. Navy remains the main maritime force capable of defending access through a crisis. If the route becomes chronically dangerous, the damage is not limited to fuel cost alone. It affects how allies judge American staying power, how markets judge U.S. control of strategic sea lanes, and how adversaries judge the price Washington will pay to preserve international commerce. The choke point crisis, therefore, becomes a test not only of maritime security, but of geopolitical authority. There is also a temporal dimension that deserves more attention. A route like Hormuz can function as a crisis accelerant because it compresses the delay between military danger and economic effect. Some foreign policy problems take a long time to reach ordinary life. Hormuz does not. Oil benchmarks can move quickly, tanker rates can move quickly, inventory strategies can change quickly, and the public can start feeling the consequences before policymakers have time to settle on a coherent long-term answer. That speed gives the choke point political power. It forces governments to react under time pressure instead of planning under calm conditions. The result is that Hormuz is not merely a route to watch in wartime. It is a route whose peacetime credibility has to be defended continuously once a crisis begins. A state that wants leverage does not need to close it forever. It only needs to make the route feel exposed enough that every participant starts making defensive adjustments. In that sense, the Strait is both a physical corridor and a confidence machine. When it works, global trade benefits quietly. When it fails, the consequences are transmitted through prices, policy, and military posture with unusual speed. There is another way to see the same problem. In a normal sea lane, delay can often be absorbed because ships can space out, reroute, or arrive through several alternative corridors. In Hormuz, the concentration is part of the crisis. Too much volume depends on too little room. That means the issue is not only whether a tanker can physically pass on one given day. The issue is whether the whole line of tankers, charterers, terminals, and buyers behind it still believes passage will remain broadly dependable over the next week, the next month, and the next quarter. That is why bypass capacity matters and still does not solve the problem. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates do have routes that can move some volume around the choke point. But the EIA's point is that the bypass remains partial. A partial bypass changes the severity of the shock, does not erase the leverage created by the route itself. Markets understand that. Exporters understand that. Importers understand that. And once everyone understands that, the choke point keeps its power even before a complete disruption occurs. This is also why states far from the Gulf monitor Hormuz so closely. Government in East Asia is not asking only whether one cargo arrives. It is asking whether a whole fuel system remains predictable. A government in Europe is asking whether tighter Gulf flows will raise competition for alternative cargoes and put more inflationary pressure on economies already sensitive to energy costs. Washington asks a broader question still. If a Gulf disruption hits allies, shipping, inflation, and force posture at the same time, can the United States treat the crisis as merely regional? In practice, it cannot. The Strait also matters because it converts military events into civilian consequences with remarkable speed. A political crisis elsewhere might take months to filter into ordinary life. A crisis in Hormuz can start moving crude benchmarks, tanker rates, and insurance costs almost immediately. That means the American consumer, the Indian refiner, the Japanese utility buyer, the European chemical producer, and the Gulf exporter are all linked to the same patch of water, even if they never think about it directly. Very few places in international politics create that kind of fast transmission from missile risk to grocery bills and inflation forecasts. Once that physical dependence is clear, Iran's strategy makes more sense. Tehran does not need to imagine some perfect dramatic closure in order to gain leverage. It needs to understand what the Strait already is. A place where limited pressure can have outsized consequences because everyone knows the route cannot be fully replaced. That is the basic logic of coercion in Hormuz. You do not need to stop every ship. You need to make passage feel uncertain enough that security costs rise, commercial behavior changes, and rival governments are forced to respond. That is why a neat phrase like "shut down the Strait" can be misleading. It sounds as if there are only two states, open and closed. The real world is messier. There are degrees of pressure, degrees of hesitation, and degrees of degraded confidence. Iran can exploit that gray area. Coastal launch sites, drones, missiles, maritime harassment, and the threat of repeated attacks do not need to create a formal barrier across the water. They only need to produce enough friction that the route stops feeling routine. Military and market history both teach the same lesson here. Shipping is not just about whether a tanker physically can sail from one point to another. It is about whether the crew will accept the risk, whether the owner can ensure the transit, whether the charterer can tolerate delay, whether the naval situation is clear enough to trust an escort, and whether multiple incidents begin to suggest a pattern rather than a one-off danger. In a major choke point, perception can be operationally decisive. Iran's pressure strategy takes advantage of that. A threat can come from the coast. It can come from an unmanned system. It can come from a missile battery, a radar network, a fast boat, or the possibility that a vessel will be challenged in ways that are hard to predict and expensive to counter. The important point is not simply the individual weapon. It is the layering. The more possible threat directions there are, the more complicated route protection becomes. Commercial movement does not stop because one weapon is unbeatable. It slows and grows more expensive because many different threats have to be priced and defended against at once. Nowhere is that pressure more visible than in the rise of drones, missiles, and other relatively cheap systems that impose very expensive defensive requirements. This is one of the core military stories of the Middle East in 2026. Not because traditional warships or air forces have become irrelevant, but because low-cost attack systems can create strategic leverage far beyond their price tag. A destroyer may be vastly more capable than a one-way attack drone. That does not change the fact that the destroyer must still detect, classify, track, and if necessary kill the drone before it can threaten a ship, a base, or a commercial lane. That defensive burden grows fast. One drone may be easy to dismiss. Several arriving from different directions, possibly mixed with missile threats or confusing small boat activity, create a much harder problem. Defenders have to maintain constant readiness. They have to preserve missile inventories. They have to keep crews sharp over long periods. They have to decide what constitutes a real threat and when to engage. In busy regional traffic, false confidence and false alarms are both dangerous. The May 7 attack on U.S. warships transiting Hormuz showed this layered problem in miniature. CENTCOM described missiles, drones, and small boats aimed at ships moving through the strait. That is the kind of combined pressure that forces a navy to think not in single weapon categories, but in battle management terms. A commander is not simply asking whether a drone can be intercepted. He is asking whether the full tactical picture is under control, while a commercial or military transit continues through constrained water. The late May drone interceptions and the May 31 strikes on radar and command nodes reveal the other side of the same equation. Defending at sea often leads to attacking the system on land that makes the sea threat possible. If drones are being launched toward regional shipping, then defense is not only about intercepting the platform in the air, it is also about finding and disabling the launch and control architecture before more attacks occur. That expands the battle space immediately. A shipping security mission becomes a campaign against nodes, sensors, and command links ashore. This is where cheap threats become strategically powerful. They push more expensive actors into broader, more active, and more visible defensive behavior. A navy cannot ignore launch sites once ships are under repeated danger, but once it strikes those sites, the political stakes rise. The attacker may have started with a relatively low-cost instrument. The defender can quickly find itself committed to a larger and more escalatory operational pattern. The economic logic is similar. Even without citing exact interceptor prices, it is clear that a high-end air defense ecosystem is not cheap to maintain. Warships, sensors, aircraft, crews, maintenance, and munitions all cost far more than the simplest attack tools arrayed against them. That does not mean defense is futile. It means defense has to be sustained by states with deep resources and political will. In a prolonged crisis, that asymmetry matters because the actor generating pressure may need only enough capacity to keep the defender spending attention and readiness. Drones also compress the distance between local and strategic effects. A launch near the Gulf Coast can trigger U.S. action, move insurance calculations, and contribute to international headlines within hours. That speed changes politics. Leaders get less time to separate signal from noise. Markets get less time to assume stability. Commanders get less time to reset. Repetition then turns isolated tactical events into a strategic pattern of insecurity. Missiles deepen the same problem because they force navies to think about magazine depth and defended footprint. A destroyer can protect a lot, but not infinitely. It protects most effectively when the threat is bounded, the picture is clear, and the defended assets are manageable. If the threat becomes layered and persistent, every transit turns into a decision about exposure, allocation, and endurance. Protecting one convoy or one warship passage is different from sustaining a regional shield over time. Commercial vessels amplify this difficulty because they are not warships. They are large, economically significant, and often vulnerable. A navy trying to reassure shipping does not merely guard itself. It has to create a protective environment for vessels that cannot see, shoot, or maneuver like military platforms. That widens the gap between the sophistication of the defender and the relative vulnerability of what is being defended. In a choke point, that gap becomes a permanent planning problem. This is what makes choke point security such a difficult category of mission. It is not pure deterrence, because the threats are already active. It is not pure warfighting, because the route is still supposed to function for commerce. It is not pure diplomacy, because ships and aircraft are doing daily tactical work. And it is not pure economic policy, even though the most politically visible consequences may be economic. Hormuz forces all of those logics into the same frame. That is why seemingly limited incidents there can carry disproportionate weight. A prolonged escort regime is a good example. At first glance, escort sounds simple. A powerful navy accompanies commercial movement and deters interference. In practice, a prolonged escort regime is a commitment to visible exposure. It means warships spend more time near the threat. It means more fuel, more maintenance, more coordination, more rules of engagement questions, and more opportunities for adversaries to study defensive patterns. It also means the protecting navy is accepting that the route can no longer be trusted to function on commercial logic alone. Once that shift happens, the crisis has already deepened conceptually, even if the public language stays cautious. There is also a hidden political cost to success. If the U.S. Navy keeps the route sufficiently open, commercial actors and allied states may grow more dependent on that protection rather than less. That is rational. It is exactly what security guarantees are for. But dependence can make it harder for Washington to scale back later. The route begins to function, not because the threat disappeared, but because U.S. protection became part of the route's normal operating condition. That may stabilize the market in the short term while increasing the long-term burden on the protecting power. Now consider the alternative. If the United States visibly reduces its role while threats continue, the commercial signal could be severe. Insurers, traders, and partner governments may read restraint as uncertainty about America's willingness to defend the route. That interpretation alone can move prices and alter policy. In this sense, Washington is constrained from both directions. More involvement creates exposure and cost. Less visible involvement creates fear about abandonment and loss of control. Hormuz punishes indecision because both action and restraint are expensive in different ways. The macroeconomic path from instability to domestic politics also deserves more detail. Start with benchmark crude. When benchmark prices rise sharply, the increase does not remain trapped inside commodity exchanges. Refiners adjust, transport firms adjust, industrial buyers hedge, freight operators face higher operating costs, agricultural sectors that rely on fuel and fertilizer face additional pressure. Retail prices then absorb part of that upstream strain. The public sees the last stage, but the whole chain moved long before the public noticed. That is why governments care so much about the early stages. By the time the voter notices, the problem is already well established upstream. Tanker rates intensify the same process because they add transport costs to price volatility. A barrel that is more expensive to insure and move can affect delivered energy costs, even if the crude benchmark itself calms somewhat. That is why the EIA's tanker rate warning matters so much. It tells us that the stress was not merely speculative. It had already entered the physical shipping economy. Once that happens, the shock becomes harder to dismiss as temporary sentiment. Inventory drawdown then removes the sense of cushion. When stocks are falling, policymakers know they have less room to absorb future disruptions. That can lead governments to become more active in public reassurance, more aggressive in diplomatic pressure, and more willing to accept maritime protection burdens they might have resisted in a calmer market. The route, therefore, shapes policy not only through present damage, but through fear of what the next disruption would do to a system already running thinner. This is where the domestic American angle becomes politically decisive. A crisis in Hormuz reaches the United States not merely because Americans care abstractly about Gulf geography, but because energy and freight costs are politically unforgiving. Fuel, shipping, and inflation are the kinds of issues that quickly become mass politics rather than specialist politics. Members of Congress begin asking what the administration is doing, Candidates begin promising stronger action or wiser restraint. Media coverage shifts from foreign affairs framing to household cost framing. And once that happens, the room for slow, technically elegant, crisis management narrows. The alliance angle matters just as much. Asian allies more exposed to Gulf energy flows may expect Washington to preserve route security. European partners may worry about another externally generated energy shock arriving through already strained markets. Gulf partners may expect not only maritime protection, but also political clarity about American staying power. These expectations do not always align perfectly, but they all point in the same direction. The United States is unlikely to be granted the luxury of acting as though Hormuz were someone else's problem. That commercial density matters more than many land-focused observers appreciate. The sea is not an empty battlefield with a few labeled icons on it. It is often a mixed legal and operational environment where warships, oil tankers, container ships, local fishing craft, offshore service vessels, smugglers, coast guards, partner navies, and plane clutter occupy the same broad picture. One reason AI at sea feels different from AI on a closed test range is that the machine has to be useful in a world where most of what it sees may not be a lawful military target at all. That changes the importance of classification discipline, a system that helps separate ordinary merchant behavior from anomalous behavior can save enormous human effort. But a system that encourages a fleet to look at every irregular maneuver as a threat can poison judgment. In crowded maritime spaces, false certainty is dangerous in both directions. Underestimate the suspicious contact, and you may lose initiative. Overestimate it, and you may turn ordinary traffic into an international incident. This is also why the Navy's interest in unmanned systems intersects with broader enforcement and maritime security missions, not only with major war. Blockade monitoring, sanctions enforcement, choke point patrol, shadow fleet behavior, and traffic analysis all reward persistent observation. An unmanned system that can remain present and keep feeding a command picture is useful even before any war begins. That matters because many future crises at sea may not declare themselves cleanly. They may begin as gray zone behavior, non-compliant navigation, harassment, covert support, or disguised logistics before they ever look like open battle. The current DVID's footage of Arleigh Burke watchstanding in the Combat Information Center while enforcing maritime blockade conditions against shipping connected to Iranian ports is revealing in this respect. It shows that the command environment is already about more than classic fleet-on-fleet combat. It is about discriminating among traffic, enforcement patterns, and legal thresholds under tension. AI and unmanned systems fit into that world naturally because they promise persistence and triage, but that same fit makes their judgment burden politically sensitive. A Navy operating in mixed traffic therefore needs something more demanding than raw machine speed. It needs machine usefulness under legal ambiguity. Can the system help a commander understand a crowded lane without quietly hardening that lane into a kill box in the minds of operators? Can it widen perception without encouraging premature hostility? These are maritime questions in the deepest sense. They arise because so much of naval power lives in the overlap between commerce, presence, coercion, and war. That overlap is one reason AI at sea may advance differently from AI on land. A naval force often spends long periods shaping behavior rather than simply destroying it. It shadows, it signals, it warns, it escorts, it reroutes, it blocks, it monitors, it reassures shipping, it demonstrates presence. That means autonomy at sea must eventually prove not only that it can support violence, but that it can support disciplined restraint in mixed maritime space. A fleet that forgets that distinction would become both dangerous and strategically clumsy. That phrase, "see farther," is more important than it sounds. Modern navies spend a lot of energy trying to expand perception without overextending scarce high-value platforms. A destroyer is valuable, but it cannot be everywhere. A manned helicopter is flexible, but it consumes crew endurance and maintenance hours. A maritime patrol aircraft can cover distance, but not continuously over every sector that matters. Unmanned surface vessels change that math. They are not magical. They do not replace all those systems, but they can occupy water, collect data, relay imagery, and remain present for long periods in ways that reduce the burden on more expensive or more fragile human-crewed assets. That is one of the least glamorous reasons autonomy matters so much. Endurance, persistence, the ability to sit and keep looking. Naval warfare is often described in terms of weapons. But before a fleet can shoot, it has to know. It has to know what is where, what changed, what is normal, what is not, which contact is linked to which network, what pattern might suggest harassment, and what emerging picture deserves the scarce attention of a commander. Task Force 59 exists because the Navy understands that the future fleet will not only be judged by how hard it can hit, it will be judged by how large a picture it can maintain before the hit is needed. That sounds abstract until you imagine the daily burden of maintaining a recognized maritime picture in a tense region. Cargo traffic is moving, fishing traffic is moving, partner navies are moving, patrol craft are moving, helicopters are checking sectors, Coast Guard assets are doing separate work. A suspicious contact may not look suspicious in isolation. It becomes suspicious because it appeared in the wrong place twice, cut across a lane oddly, lingered without clear purpose, switched transponder behavior, or correlated with some other pattern a human team might only notice after hours of staring. Machine assistance is attractive because it can keep comparing, keep flagging, keep sorting, and keep noticing repetition without boredom. But this is also where operational trust is either earned or lost. A system that alerts too often becomes noise. A system that misses the one contact that matters becomes a joke told in bitter tones in the wardroom. A system that looks impressive in a briefing but cannot survive real communications friction becomes dead weight. That is why the history of Task Force 59 matters. The command did not just run short stun events, it ran repeated operational experiments like Digital Horizon and follow-on, unmanned exercises in the 5th Fleet area. The point of those events was not simply to show that drones exist. The point was to learn what happens when autonomous systems are asked to generate useful watchstanding value in a live region full of clutter and politics. Digital Horizon is particularly revealing because it involved a mix of unmanned systems, partner participation, and real command and control questions. Official reporting described tasks like building mesh networks, relaying imagery, and launching a UAV from a U.S. Coast Guard cutter. Those details matter because they show that autonomy at sea is not just about one clever vessel. It is about architecture. One platform extends another. One unmanned system relays for another. A small vehicle broadens the picture for a larger one. A cutter or destroyer becomes not only a patrol ship, but a node in a more distributed sensing web. That web changes the rhythm of command. In an older picture, the commanding officer and his immediate teams depended more heavily on the sensors, aircraft, and lookouts directly attached to their own unit or strike group. In a more distributed unmanned picture, the commander begins receiving a wider and more persistent river of machine-collected information. That is powerful. It is also dangerous. A wider river of data does not automatically produce clearer judgment. Sometimes it only creates the illusion of omniscience. The challenge shifts from finding any data at all to identifying what in the flood actually matters. The broader air, surface, subsurface, and logistics system around the carrier is what gives that flexibility credibility. A carrier with no escorts is an image. A carrier with escorts, airborne warning, replenishment support, disciplined deck cycle management, and a functioning command picture is a force. The difference between those two things is the difference between looking powerful and being powerful. Much of naval planning is an attempt to maintain that difference under friction. Can the group keep its picture? Can it keep fuel flowing? Can it keep aircraft safe and ready? Can it distribute risk across multiple platforms? Can it continue to make decisions before events force decisions onto it? That last question brings us back to command. A strike group commander is not making decisions inside a vacuum. There are standing instructions, theater requirements, coalition considerations, where relevant national command authority and the practical limits of what public forces can safely identify and engage. The public rarely sees this because command judgment is not as visually dramatic as a launch. But the capacity to make disciplined decisions under uncertainty is one of the strike group's greatest strengths. The group exists to produce options that are militarily real and politically usable. A commander who can present those options clearly has already increased national power before a shot is fired. This is another way of saying that the ocean is not empty, because decisions move across it, messages move across it, aircraft move across it, tankers and supply ships move across it, merchant shipping moves across it, escorts and submarines move across it. The sea is full not only of metal, but of consequence. That is why control of maritime space is never just about a single ship, and never just about a single battle. It is about the ability to sustain presence, organize force, manage uncertainty, and keep open the flows on which military and economic life depend. When people see a carrier in a photograph, they often see scale first. That instinct is understandable. The ship is built to dominate the frame, but scale is only the beginning of the story. The deeper truth is coordination. Aircraft, destroyers, submarines, replenishment oilers, airborne warning platforms, radars, engineers, cooks, deck crews, watchstanders, and commanders all contribute to the same strategic object. They make it possible for a state to write its policy far from home and keep writing it after the first line. That is what a carrier strike group really is. Not a lone symbol of power, but a moving argument that the sea can be watched, used, defended, and shaped. So the next time the carrier is described as if it were simply a giant ship surrounded by water, it is worth remembering what that description leaves out. It leaves out the destroyer radar picture. It leaves out the E-2D orbit. It leaves out the submarine somewhere ahead, unseen, and intentionally quiet. It leaves out the replenishment oiler that makes tomorrow possible. It leaves out the industrial rhythm beneath the flight deck. It leaves out the trade routes that make maritime control meaningful in the first place. Most of all, it leaves out the human labor that translates vast systems into daily readiness. The ocean is not empty. It is layered with commerce, strategy, maintenance, fuel, watchstanding, weather, intelligence, and risk. The carrier strike group matters because it can operate inside all those layers at once. It can fight if ordered, deter if needed, reassure when useful, and remain on station long enough to matter. That is why carriers continue to dominate political imagination and naval planning alike. They are not merely where aircraft launch. They are where presence becomes organized power. There is one more reason endurance matters, and it is easy to miss if every conversation stays focused on the weapons themselves. A strike group does not simply arrive in a region and become useful on the basis of arrival alone. It has to learn the operating pattern around it. It has to absorb weather, traffic, reporting rhythms, replenishment timing, and the habits of nearby friendly and unfriendly forces. Commanders and watch teams build that understanding over days, not seconds. Presence grows sharper with time. The longer the group remains effective on station, the better it can distinguish what is routine from what is unusual. That is another form of power. Not only the power to strike, but the power to know a region well enough that small changes begin to stand out before they become large problems. Weather is part of that knowledge as well. The sea is often described as if it were a simple maneuver space, but sea state, visibility, cloud cover, and wind all shape what a strike group can do and how confidently it can do it. Aircraft launch and recovery cycles depend on real deck conditions, not abstract readiness slides. Helicopter work depends on whether the air and sea allow stable operation. Replenishment depends on ships holding station safely while lines and hoses come across. Radar performance, lookout confidence, and small craft detection are all affected by the environment. The ocean is therefore never just a map background for power projection. is an active participant in the problem, constantly rewarding disciplined seamanship and punishing any force that starts treating routine as guaranteed. There is also the matter of allied and partner familiarity. A carrier strike group rarely operates as though no one else exists in the region. It works near partner navies, commercial traffic, coalition command relationships where they apply, and a constant flow of diplomatic signaling above the tactical picture. Interoperability in this context is not a slogan. It means compatible procedures, shared reporting habits, understood communications routines, and enough mutual confidence that separate forces can occupy the same maritime problem without creating confusion for one another. The group therefore carries political value, not only because it is armed, but because it is legible to friends. Allies can read its presence as reassurance because they understand the system behind the silhouette. That returns us to the central point. Open water only looks empty to people who are not accounting for all the structures moving across it. Trade routes structure it. Replenishment schedules structure it. Air wing cycles structure it. Sensor coverage structures it. Command relationships structure it. Deterrence itself structures it, because every state in the region adjusts behavior according to what it believes the strike group can still see, still launch, still defend, and still sustain tomorrow. The carrier is the symbol most people remember. The deeper reality is a force that keeps turning distance into usable time. And that is why the ocean is not empty. It is full of systems, decisions, and dependencies, and the carrier strike group matters because it can survive inside that complexity long enough to shape it.